Criticism is a normal part of life, at work, in relationships, even in healthy communities. But for some people, criticism doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels deeply personal. And when that happens, it often reveals that identity is still tied to performance or approval. Hi, my name is Malcolm Lilienthal. I'm a mental health therapist, a coach, and the creator of the Titan Blueprint, which is a framework designed to help people master their thoughts, emotions, and identity so they can live with clarity, discipline, and purpose. On this channel, we explore the deeper forces that shape human behavior, from psychology and personal development to philosophy, leadership, and biblical wisdom. The goal is to understand why we think the way we think, why we react the way we react, and how those patterns shape the direction of our lives. The mission here is simple: to help you recognize the patterns that may be quietly controlling your life, reclaim your identity, and reclaim your authority over your mind, and develop a kind of resilience that allows you to face life's challenges without losing who you are. So let's start here. Criticism is something every person encounters, right? So it could be feedback from a manager, or a difficult conversation in a relationship, or a comment about something you did wrong. But in theory, it's feedback about behavior, decisions, or even outcomes. But in practice, criticism rarely feels neutral. Can you agree with me? Well, I would say for some people, criticism lands like a small inconvenience, right? They evaluate the feedback, decides whether it's useful, and move forward. But most people, or I would say for other people, criticism hits much deeper, like it triggers defensiveness or shame, or an immediate urge to explain themselves. So sometimes the emotional reaction is far stronger than the situation itself. And afterward, the person may find themselves replaying the moment repeatedly in their minds. Why does this happen? Well, from a psychological perspective, criticism often feels painful when it threatens something connected to identity. And if a person's sense of self is tied strongly to, something like competence, criticism can feel like a threat to their worth. If identity is tied to approval, criticism can feel like rejection. If identity is tied to being responsible or even dependable, criticism may feel like failure. So in other words, the reaction is not just about the comment, it's about the comment or what the comment appears to say about who you are. So you might be thinking, but Malcolm, shouldn't criticism bother us at least a little? Of course. But human beings are relational creatures, right? Our minds naturally pay attention to feedback from others. So the issue isn't criticism, or the issue isn't that criticism produces emotion, which is energy in motion. The issue is how deeply it penetrates identity. So when identity is strongly tied to performance or approval, criticism feels threatening because it appears to undermine the very foundation of self-worth. Does that make sense? So, for example, the mind quickly shifts into protection mode. Like, like, like some people become defensive. So they explain, they justify, or they argue. And others turn inward. So they become self-critical, replaying the moment, like repeatedly and questioning their value. And so both reactions are attempts to restore identity stability. And now here's where the pattern often begins. Most people grew up in environments where approval and performance were closely connected. So praise appeared when things were done well, right? And disappointment often appeared, or disappointment appeared when mistakes happened. So over time, the mind quietly formed a belief, and beliefs are something that we believe are true. So my value depends on how well I perform, or my worth depends on how others perceive me. And once that belief becomes embedded, criticism begins to feel dangerous. Does that make sense? So it's not feeling dangerous. Look, it's not because the feedback itself is catastrophic. It's because it appears to threaten the person's sense of self. So this is why high performing individuals often feel criticism so intensely, right? Um, they care deeply about doing things well and they hold themselves to high standards. But if their identity becomes fused with performance, even small feedback can feel like a judgment, like of the entire self. So some people respond to this by trying to avoid criticism entirely, and they become perfectionistic, or they over prepare, or they analyze every decision carefully. But avoiding criticism rarely solves the deeper problem because the underlying issue is still identity. And this is where the Christian framework offers something I think it's really stabilizing. According to the gospel, your identity is not established by flawless performance and is not secured by universal approval. Your identity is rooted in Christ. It's seated at the right hand of the Father. Now, that does not mean criticism suddenly becomes enjoyable, but it does change how criticism is interpreted. So, if your worth is not dependent on performance, criticism becomes information rather than condemnation. Or if your identity is not dependent on, approval, feedback is no longer determining your value. So you can evaluate criticism with clarity, right? You can accept what is true. You can discard what is inaccurate. And continuing moving forward becomes easier because you continue moving forward without feeling like your entire identity is under threat. Does that make sense? So psychologically, this creates emotional stability because feedback no longer destabilizes the core of who you are. So if criticism tends to hit you deeply, it can be helpful to slow down and examine what's internally happening. So when criticism appears, you can ask yourself, what exactly about this comment feels threatening? Is it the possibility that you made a mistake, or the fear of looking incompetent, or the concern that someone's opinion of you might change? Then ask yourself another question. What belief about myself is being activated right now? Am I assuming that making a mistake means I failed as a person? Am I interpreting feedback as rejection? And then maybe finally ask yourself this. If my identity is secure in Christ, how would I interpret this criticism differently? Because when identity is stable, feedback becomes easier to process without emotional collapse. Criticism feels personal when identity is tied closely to performance or maybe even approval. When feedback appears to threaten those foundations, the mind reacts quickly in an attempt to protect the self. Defensiveness, shame, and when we that overanalysis are often signs that identity is being challenged. The deeper promise of the gospel is that your worth is not established by flawless performance or universal approval. Does that make sense? So it's anchored in something far more stable. Your identity in Christ. And when that truth becomes deeply internalized, criticism begins to lose its power to destabilize you. And it's not because feedback stops mattering. It's it's because your identity is no longer fragile. Does that make sense? Remember that titans aren't born, they're forged.